Hey Artnerds, today we're putting the Spectrum Noir Triblend markers, both the brush and the bullet, to the Natosoup Studio field test, and we're going to color this beautiful mermaid today. If you want to color along with me, you can find a link to the line art down in the description below. If you're one of my wonderful art nerds on Patreon and you support the work I do every month, you get a free download of this line art. So to begin with, we're going to recap the Triblend markers just a little bit. I reviewed these not too long ago, and you'll be able to find a link to that review in the cards, but it wasn't a full review. It was mostly an unbox and swatch review. Now, I am testing out the Triblend brush markers. Those are newer to the channel. A while back, I tried out the Triblend bullet tip markers, and I've been using those to do a series of monochrome illustrations, but I was really excited when Spectrum Noir announced that they were releasing a brush option for the Triblend markers. Now, these are 3-in-1 markers. You get 3 colors in one marker, and they're designed to be perfect blends, but I found from my swatching that not all of those triads work so well together. I also had some pretty serious misgivings about the brushes included on the new brush markers. I was really disappointed that Spectrum Noir went with a fiber brush tip rather than a replaceable foam rubber brush tip. Hopefully, though, Spectrum Noir will hear my pleas and consider making a 3rd generation of these markers. But to be real, I've reviewed a lot of Spectrum Noir products in the past, and they never really listen to me, so I don't expect them to start now. There's still a lot of stuff I like about these markers, though. The $4.99 price point, where you basically get 3 colors in one, is just about too good to pass up, and I would still recommend these to somebody who's new to alcohol markers and they want an easy intro to them. So you guys will be able to find links to these markers down in the description below, as well as links to some of the other materials used in this field test. I am inking and markering today on Strathmore 300 series Smooth Bristol. So this is a heavier uncoated paper that I really like using with alcohol markers, and some of my other alcohol marker tutorials here on the channel utilize these markers. I'm inking with Tombow Fudenosuke brush pins, the colorful brush pins, and I'm using, the basic 12 set plus some of the new neon colors. Now, what I like about these brush pins is they are alcohol marker safe, which is really important for this, and they are also waterproof, which makes them a colorful inking addition to your art arsenal. And they're very easy to use, and you can find them increasingly everywhere. I think I saw them at Walmart like last week, but you can also find them at Michael's. You can find them at most brick and mortar art supply stores, and you can definitely find them on Amazon. And like I said earlier, I'll have a link down in the description below if you'd like to try them out. So I'm utilizing a colored line art for this, and basically what I'm doing is, when you saw that post-it note, I had notes on what colors I wanted to use, like what Spectrum Noir Triblend colors I wanted to use for what areas on this mermaid. I'm trying to use as many colors as possible while still having a cohesive design, and knowing what I'm going to color with what colors allows me to do colored line art like this. And basically, I start with the local color or the base color. So like her scale top here is going to be a dark red when I'm finished. So I ink it with a regular red, and then I go in and ink the shadows with purple. You can do just the local color. You can do the local color with one shadow. You can do a highlight, the local color, and a shadow. It's up to you and how detailed you want to get with this. Like I said, I've used this technique in some of my other marker tutorials here on the channel, and I'll link those in the cards as well as in the description. I think you guys will really enjoy those. Now, they are not done with the Spectrum Noir Triblend markers, but I'll also be sure to link some of the monochrome illustrations that I've done using the bullet tips if you guys are looking for some more marker inspiration. I think those are particularly great because I use just one of the Triblend markers to create a full illustration. And that's one of the things I really like about the Triblend markers is you can have just one marker and you can already start making art. And there are no other alcohol markers on the market that I can think of maybe the chameleons, but frankly I kind of struggle to use the chameleons, and the Triblend markers are so much easier to use than the chameleon markers. But there are no other alcohol markers that I know of on the market that let you start making fully rendered, albeit monochromatic, art pieces the moment you unpackage your marker. So I also want to take a moment to point out that I have no affiliation with Spectrum Noir whatsoever. These markers were purchased out of pockets with funds raised from my Patreon, and this channel sees no outside sponsorship, no NordVPN, no Skillshare, none of that, just me, you, and Patreon. So if you enjoy the work I do here on the channel, please consider joining me over on Patreon. I'll have a link down in the description for you guys as well. So as I mentioned in part 1 of this 2-part review, the bullet tip Triblends come in 48 colors. The brush tips only come in 24, and I do not own a full set of either. I own open stock piecemeal colors picked up here and there, both in person and from Simon Says Stamp. You can also get them on Amazon. But I would recommend, unless you just absolutely love this concept, buying 1 or 2, playing around with them, and seeing if they're right for you. So I started with her eyes using the lightest color in the Vintage Blue blend. So that would be VB1. And I'm also blending out when necessary with a colorless blender. I don't happen to own a Spectrum Noir colorless blender anymore. And frankly, most colorless blenders are just about the same, so I'm using a Copic colorless blender for this. So for her tail, I am starting out with the lightest color in the Antique Pink blend, which is kind of a muted pink as you guys see here. So I'm using AP2. And I do believe that the Triblend colors correlate with the regular Spectrum Noir lineup, so if you already own some Spectrum Noir markers, these could be a great addition to that collection as well. And you can see that the Antique Pink that I own is a bullet tip, so it takes a really long time to color in with these. So be patient, and if you have arthritis problems like me, these may not be such a good fit for you because these hexagonal bodies are hard on the hands, and when you're coloring as slowly as you need to with bullet tip markers, it just kind of makes that take even longer. So I wanted her to have kind of a scaly pattern on her skin in addition to on her tail. So I am using that lightest Antique Pink color, our AP2, our light, to start sketching in some areas where I'm going to apply scales later. I also want to take a moment to point out that this video has been heavily time-lapsed to get it down to under 30 minutes. It took me several hours one evening to color this piece, and it took me about 40 minutes to ink this piece. So if you're watching this and you're like, gosh, why am I so slow? You're not slow. This is very time-lapsed. So now that I have the base layer on the tail and the skin filled in, it's time for me to start with my base skin tone. I'm kind of limited in the colors that I picked up, so I am using what Spectrum Noir calls their Fair Skin Blend, which, as I mentioned in the first video, I kind of have a problem with that. They should have just left it at apricot. But I am using FS6, which is the lightest color in this triad, to apply a base color to her skin. And the brush tip goes so much faster than that bullet tip. It's so much easier to use. And while I really don't like fiber tips, it was actually not as bad as I thought it would be in the unbox and swatch video on the Strathmore Bristol paper. And Bristol is neat in that it's a little bit more tightly woven than, say, mixed media paper. I didn't have nearly the bleeding problems I thought I was going to have. So I'm applying another layer of our lightest color on top of the base color. Basically, I'm going to use my overblending technique when it comes to her skin, leaving the white of the paper, blending it out with the Colorless blender, and trying to apply additional layers to build up that color. So I could have moved on to FS7, the mid-tone color, but I want to utilize each of the colors in the triad as much as possible so that I can get as smooth a blend as possible and I can really demonstrate the range each marker has. Now, some of these markers have a whole lot of range and some of these markers have very little range. So it really kind of varies marker to marker depending on the colors that they've included in each individual marker. And I don't really mind if I blend out the initial scales that I put down using antique pink. I can always go back and kind of redraw them, reaffirm them, darken them, whatever you want to call it. But by kind of blending them out like this, it makes it look like it belongs on her skin and it's part of her skin. So something else I want to point out about these very much time-lapse alcohol marker tutorials and reviews is that sometimes it's difficult for me to cover everything or talk about everything as much as I'd like. So now I'm using the second color in our triad, the FS7, which is not really that much darker than the first one. That's kind of what I mean by some of these colors just, there's not enough gradation or enough steps in between each color to really give you enough contrast. And that's one of my big womps, one of my big problems with these markers is I'm just really not able to build up enough contrast with these. I want to love them so bad. I think the concept is so interesting and I think Spectrum Noir really did something novel here. I need a little bit more from you guys, just a little bit more. So I am applying a blush color with the mid-tone of the Coral Blend, which is one of my favorite colors in this marker. Actually, I lied to you. I'm starting with the lightest, so I'm starting with CR1, and then I'm going in with the middle one, CR3. And you can see how short the marker gets as you just kind of pop the markers off. So it's a little bit like handling a baton at first, like this long marker body that you can twirl in your fingers if you really want to, if you're prone to that like I am. And it does tend to hit my camera a lot. So these are a little bit more tricky to record, especially if you really want to get up in there and get some of those shots. So I'm just kind of reaffirming some of the scales on her skin, and I'm using the middle color, so that would be AP3. And another thing about these markers, because they are glossy and black, they wreak havoc with my colors, my camera's light meter. So I apologize, there's going to be some lighting inconsistency. It's because the shiny black bodies just really mess with my camera. And like I said in the original unbox and swatch, matte bodies would have been easier to handle and they would have looked so much nicer. So for her eyes, I started with a little bit of the turquoise or blue turquoise blend, probably BT3, and then I'm going over it with the Jade green blend. And the Jade green blend is more of a blue green than like a true green. And I started with JG1, did the top shadow with JG2, and then added the iris in with JG3. So on her tail, I found that the antique pink is a little too muted, so I wanted to light it up a little bit in the tail. So using the lightest of the pale pink blend, which would be PP1, I just kind of applied that all over the tail. And then I'm kind of going in and applying another layer here and there, using Antique Pink again with the AP2. Now, I'm not really concerned too much about streaking because I tend to, when I work with markers, I tend to apply a lot of layers and I do a lot of blending. So streaking isn't as noticeable in my art style when I'm finished with it. But if you don't like applying as many layers, if you don't want to use up your markers, the bullet tip Triblend markers are very prone to streaking, so that's something you're going to want to keep in mind. So for her hair, I wanted something really fun, so I'm using the lightest color of the blue turquoise blend, which would be BT3. I feel like that's a band name, right? And you can see it's just kind of tedious with the bullet tip. Now, I chose to buy bullet tips. That's on me. They are available in brush, but I do want to make it a point that if you have arthritis problems, if you're very impatient, if you don't like bullet tips, go ahead and get the brush tips when those colors are, or as those colors are available. Like I said, they have about half as many colors as the full Triblend line. Now to add in some shadow and some depth, I'm going in with Vintage Blue Blend, and it looks like I'm using the middle color to start adding in some shadow to our blue turquoise blend. So I'm using VB2, or the mid-tone for this. And that's one of the things you really have to keep in mind when you're using the Triblend markers. If you want some contrast, if you want some depth, you gotta start mixing your colors. You gotta start layering your colors. You can't just stick to one marker at a time if you want to add some depth. It's kind of like training wheels where you can make some pretty things using just those blends and kind of just those areas and not doing any shadow colors. But as soon as you want to do something a little bit more advanced, you got to start mixing those colors. Now, if you're a fan of mermaids and you like markers, I have quite a few tutorials here on the channel where I show you guys how to color beautiful mermaids using different alcohol markers. I promise it's not all just Triblend. Check the description down below for those links. So now I'm using the Copic, it's a Copic Ciao, which is like the cheapest of the Copic lineup. A Copic Ciao colorless blender just to blend out some of those highlights, to soften some of those highlights. So what it's going to do is it's going to push the dye base marker to the back of the paper, making it appear lighter. And now I'm going in with the second of our blue turquoise blend, BT4, the mid-tone, now that I've established some of the shadows. So hopefully you guys can see that our mid-tone color, our BT4, isn't that much darker than our lightest color, BT3. That's something that maybe Spectrum Noir might want to reconsider if they ever kind of reconfigure these markers, is putting larger steps in between the colors so that we can get better contrast with each marker. So the thing about alcohol markers is that they're a lot like watercolor in that if you apply marker on top of marker while it's still wet, you're going to get more diffused blends. If you apply it after it's had a chance to dry, you're going to get a stronger transition. So I allowed the hair to dry first, and now I'm going back in with the darkest color of our vintage blue. So that would be VB3, and I'm using that to put in some more shadows and try to get some more contrast into her hair. So for the anemones, the lilies in her hair, whatever you want to call them, I am using the Magenta Blend for 2 of them, and I'm starting with the mid-tone. No, I started with the lightest, I'm sorry, for the first one, so that would be MG1. Then I applied MG3 while it was still wet to get the diffused blend, and then I applied the darkest color, MG5. Gee whiz, it's not a Metal Gear Solid, Becca, come on. And for the larger flower, I started with our middle tone, our MG3, and then I applied our MG5 in the center, and then I blended it out a bit with our lightest, our MG1. And with a larger illustration like this, larger for me, some people work way bigger than this, but this is kind of big for me. I tend to work kind of small. I'm a comic artist. The brushes handle much better on larger illustrations than they do on smaller illustrations. You're not going to have as many bleeding problems as you would on a smaller illustration, and it's just easier to color. So for the smallest lily, I'm actually using the Hydrangea Blend. So I started with our lightest HB1, went on to HB2, and then added the center with HB3. So now her tail has had a chance to dry. We can get a stronger transition, a more striking transition. So for the base of her tail, the part that kind of curls up, I guess the bottom of her tail, I applied the middle tone, AP3. And then I took a break and I kind of tried to blend between the skin tone and her tail a little bit better using our quote-unquote fair skin blend. And now I'm going in and adding some details to her fins using the AP3. I want the fins to appear translucent. And the thing about creating translucency is it's really an illusion. You are still coloring the thing in. You're not leaving it uncolored. You're just kind of being careful about what colors you allow through the filter of the tail. So this tail was really inspired by a really beautiful fin folk tail. I'll try to link it down in the description below, but they basically make like life-size silicone mermaid tails and mermaid fins. So if that is something you can afford, and if it's something you think you're going to use, you should probably buy it from them because they make the original ones and they make some of the most beautiful ones I've seen. And I've seen a lot of knockoffs. As someone who likes to swim okay and is a Pisces and likes drawing mermaids, but is terrified of putting one of those tails on, I think they have some of the most beautiful tails. So I'm going in with the second color on the skin tones, that was FS7, and then going back in with the, let me grab it, sorry. I've got all my markers spread out in front of me and I have to find it now. So I was using the middle color on the pale pink blend, which is very close to the coral blend color too. To just kind of start working on the scales and adding more detail to the scales. So I mentioned earlier in this video that I'm trying to get all of the colors represented in this illustration, at least a little bit. And even though Normally, I would not have used the red for her top. I might have used the purple, or I might have used one of the pinks. Like I said, I wanted to represent all of the colors, at least a little bit. So I am using the dark red blend. I started with our lightest color, DR1, and I'm trying to show the translucency of the tail. So for the scales underneath the tail, I'm leaving a lot more rim lighting with our DR1. And I'm coloring in more of the scales outside of the tail using the mid-color DR3. So you can see it kind of starts to create kind of a veiled effect where the fin has gone over the top. And then finally, I'm going in, I can't tell if I'm doing another layer of DR3 and building up that color, or if I've switched over to the darkest color, which is DR4. That's the tricky thing about these tri-blends. So the second color and the third color are in the same little bitty marker. And I have an image from Spectrum Noir in the first video that kind of shows how the ink is allocated. And it's just hard to tell which tip I'm using because it's so short and because the color collars are so similar usually. So I'm trying to increase the translucency on the tail a little bit more as it crosses over the tail. So I went in with the lightest color on the pale pink blend, just trying to blend that out a little bit. And now I'm going in with the second to darkest color, our PP4 in the pale pink blend. And I'm starting to kind of sketch in some of the koi splotches on her tail and on her fins. And like I said, this one's a weird one because the middle color is more of like a coral color, and then the darkest is more of a bubblegum pink, and it just doesn't really make sense as a transition. Speaking of that darkest color, I'm now going in with our darkest color, our PP6, and I'm just kind of doing some light splotches here and there to create a pattern on her tail. And on the edges of her fins, I'm using a little bit of the golden brown blend. So this is GB1, and it's kind of like a light yellow in its lightest colors, or like a very pale skin tone. And I'm just applying that towards the edges of the fins, bringing in some additional color. And then in the little divots of the scallops on her tail, I'm going to use a little bit of GB3, the middle color, just to add in a little bit of a darker yellow and to create some more contrast. I'm dabbing in a little bit of the lightest of the vintage blue blend, which would be VB1, into the scales. And I'm basically at the point where I'm just kind of massaging this into what I want it to be. I have everything kind of basically colored in, everything kind of basically filled in. So now I'm working on adding contrast and creating shadows and adding in detail. So this is the darkest of the Hydrangea Blend, so that would be HB3. No, I lied to you. It's the second darkest. I told you guys, it's hard to tell which one's which. HB2, so the middle color. And then going back in with a lighter variant of the Vintage Blue, so that was probably VB1. And now I'm going in with the darkest of the Hydrangea Blend. But really, when it comes to alcohol markers, you guys you can take inspiration from what I'm doing and take inspiration from my color choices, but I really want you guys to pick your own colors based on what you like. And before I start any marker piece, I work from swatches. Sometimes I show them to you guys, sometimes I have them off camera. For this piece, I was working with swatches from my swatch book. So the alcohol marker test book I usually do my tests in. I wanted to work on something a little bit larger this time just because A, working on larger pieces can be a lot of fun and I tend to work so small, and I wanted to work on Strathmore Bristol because it has a smoother texture. So for the pearls, I started with the lightest of Vintage Blue. So that was VB1. Then I went over it with some of the Blue Turquoise Blend, which is a really pretty color, by the way. So that was BT3. And then I probably went in with a little bit of the Jade Green Blend, so JG1. And then I probably went back in with the middle tone of our Jade Green, so JG2. And now I'm using the darkest tone on our Antique Pink blend. So that was AP4. Now the only problem I really have with the Antique Pink blend is it is an antique pink. It's a more subdued color, and it does feel a little bit muddy in this particular piece. There's nothing wrong with the color itself, and I actually think the three colors they selected to make up the Antique Pink blend work really well together, and I look forward to doing a monochrome illustration with that color blend. It just kind of seemed a little bit more down key than I think I was looking for at the time. I remember when I was coloring it being kind of like, oh, this looks kind of muddy, but I actually really, really like the finished piece now. And to create the scales, I'm basically just kind of scribbling in like scale shapes, and you might want to reference fish tails or fish for this if you're not really familiar with what scales look like. So that's the base illustration done, but we're not done yet. I still want to do a background. I do have to say the bullet tips are just so hard on my hands. The brush tips at this size are actually a lot of fun. So if you work larger, the brush tips are probably going to be great for you, but you might want to avoid using these on really porous papers that are prone to spidering unless that's something you're looking for. So now I'm using, it's like Post-it tape. It's not really masking tape, but it's like sticky note tape to create a border or a mask around my image. And then I lost my mind and I'm doing the water with Vintage Blue. And that's going to allow the hair to pop more and the flowers to pop more and the tail itself to pop more because it's more of a subdued color. So I'm starting with the lightest color, VB1, and this thing is a bullet tip, and this thing just about kills my hand. My hand was already really tired after coloring the mermaid using bullet tips with these large, chunky, weirdly shaped hexagonal markers, but coloring in the background was the last straw with these. If you're gonna do the Triblend markers and you want to color in backgrounds, I would recommend getting the brush tip markers for anything you think might be a background. So like sky blue, ocean blue, those kind of colors, get those in the brush tip, even if you don't like brush tips, because it's going to save your hand so much wear and tear. So I wanted to create kind of this faded ombre effect. So I am kind of layering the colors, and I'm also kind of transitioning the colors. So what that means is I started with our VB1, our lightest color, did it from top to bottom, did a little bit of Colorless blender at the top just to kind of push that back. Then I did a layer of VB2, starting about 1/4 of the way down, and I blended that back out with our VB1. And I'm going to do that all the way down to the bottom of the illustration. And then I'm going to use our darkest color in the vintage blue set, our VB3, and basically do the same thing. Now, I'm also spritzing some rubbing alcohol and dripping some rubbing alcohol. Spritzing it is going to create kind of a misty effect and break up some of the streakiness. It's a trick I use pretty often when I'm using bullet tip markers just to hide how streaky they can be. And I'm dripping rubbing alcohol on to create kind of a bubble effect. And I actually really like how it ended up turning out. So now we remove our masking tape, and all that's really left is the final details. I might go back in and adjust some of the contrast with the Tombow Foot and Osques, and I may go in and add some additional marker here and there, blending some things and kind of adjusting the scales. And I'm going to use some white gouache to add some highlights. So I mentioned earlier it's difficult for me to build up contrast, at least with the markers that I have here using the Triblend blends. So I'm going in with the Tombow Foot and Osques and adding in some darker line art just to kind of up that contrast just a little bit. So the brush handles a lot better than the bullet on a larger piece like this. It's faster and it's easier to handle. You don't notice how weird and uncomfortable the hexagonal bodies are as much with the brush. It is difficult to build up enough contrast. Everything seems to be about the same tone and intensity. I don't know if it's the colors I picked or if it's the markers themselves, but I relied really heavily on the tritone, the 3 colors in one marker, to kind of do my shading and to build up my contrast rather than, you know, amassing a large collection of markers like I would usually rely on if I was doing other marker pieces. I'm going to link some other marker tutorials in the description so you guys can kind of compare how I handle, you know, regular alcohol markers against these Triblend markers. For colors you think you're going to use in large areas, I recommend getting the brush tip. Your hand will thank you. The hexagonal body is really hard on my arthritis. There should be a Natto Soup bingo card. Like, hey, Artnerds would be one of them. My arthritis would be one of them. For a while, I was talking a lot about my mom hitting my car. But yeah, I gave myself early onset arthritis while I was at SCAD. And I try to be mindful of it, and I talk about it a lot because I'm only 34. I started having arthritis problems in my 20s. I don't want you guys to have arthritis problems in your 20s, and I also know there are a lot of older artists who already have arthritis problems. So it's something I always mention because I have friends who have health issues that result in arthritis issues, and they're going to care whether or not these markers are going to really hurt their hands. So finally, I'm going in with just a little bit of white gouache and adding some details here and there, just kind of creating some pops of highlight. And I really like how this mermaid came out. She is so stinking cute. And even though I have some complaints about the markers, I had a lot of fun making this piece. Speaking of complaints, it is time for the pros and cons. Did I revise my opinion on the Spectrum Noir Triblend markers? That is always such a mouthful to say. All right, so the pros. You get 3 markers in one. I still think that is a huge pro. That is what sets these apart. Finally, Spectrum Noir brought some innovation to the table. And for $4.99 per 3-in-1 marker, that is a dang good deal. And that makes these affordable and accessible to artists who might not otherwise be able to afford traditional art supplies. The brush markers handled a lot better than I expected if you're working on a larger illustration with a coated paper like this Bristol here. For the original unboxed and swatch, I was using Strathmore mixed media paper, and that's an uncoated paper, and it's a very thirsty, bleedy, blendy paper, and these spidered out all over the place. And I am so sorry about that coughing in the background. My husband was playing DDR, and now he's hacking up a storm, and I don't know why. So for the cons, the bullet markers are really hard on my hand. The hexagonal body makes it even worse. I mean, my hand was aching really bad. I had to go soak it in hot water when I was finished with this piece. The bullet nibs have a weaker ink flow, so they're streakier and they're harder to blend than their brush counterparts. And I had a lot of trouble building up contrast to the point where I re-inked this piece just to add in some more contrast. So I don't know if it's because I just don't have enough of these markers, or if these markers just can't quite deliver as much blending as we might want them to. Maybe there's just not enough difference in the individual colors. Regardless, I had a lot of fun coloring this piece with you guys. I always enjoy doing marker art with you guys, and I hope you guys enjoy my marker tutorials. I hope you guys will check out some of the ones that I've linked down in the description below, and let me know if there's some cool marker on the market that I haven't reviewed yet. I have loads of alcohol marker reviews. I have a whole playlist of them, so if you're on the market for markers and you want to know what I think, you should check out that playlist. I'll link it down in the description below. I am really, really happy with how this piece turned out. She's absolutely gorgeous, and I hope you guys enjoyed coloring along with me. Speaking of, if you would like to color along, there will be a link down in the description where you can purchase this line art to color if you so wish. I had a fantastic time with you guys. I hope this was helpful, useful, and inspiring, and I hope to see you guys again really soon. Bye, guys.